Russia is in the news recently because of a military buildup on the border of East Ukraine. So here we have a map where we're looking at Ukraine, and you can see where it sits in Europe. It's way out to the east, next to the enormous space that is Russia. The areas highlighted in light green are disputed. Crimea has been occupied by Russia since its annexation in 2014, while there has been an ongoing conflict, a proxy war, you might say, in the East Donbas region of East Ukraine. So I thought I'd run through a brief history of Ukraine so that our viewers from across the world can get a bit more of an idea of what this place is and who we're talking about. So essentially, Ukraine, the capital is Kiev, which is roughly in the middle of the blob that you can see on the map there. Kiev was one of the center points of the Rus civilization in the Dark Ages. The Vikings essentially came down from Scandinavia and they took over this area. Then following on from that, in later years, the area was occupied by Cossacks, including the Zaporizhian Cossacks, and it was part of the Russian Empire for a long time, even though a lot of the people living in this region were nomads. Following the end of the Russian Empire in the First World War, the Russian Civil War started, which I believe you're quite well acquainted with, Callum. And during that period, Ukraine gained its independence tentatively as a separate Soviet of the United Soviet Socialist Republics. So it wasn't independent at all, but it was a separate economic unit for a long period of time. During this period, in the late 1920s and 1930s, it experienced a famine known as the Holodomor, which has been quite accurately referred to as a genocide, which we've covered previously on our site, and millions of Ukrainians were forcibly starved to death, even though they were the ones growing most of the grain to feed the Soviet Union. It was a pretty bad time. That was then quickly followed by World War II, where again a lot of Ukrainians died as the invasion of the Nazis went straight through Ukraine, and then the reconquest of the Soviets also went straight back through Ukraine. And we could go into the deep and tragic story of Ukraine in this period, but let's move on. So if we take a look at the demographics of Ukraine here, so this is just population density, including the Crimea. You can see that there is a concentration of population over in the east as well as in the rest of the country. Now, it's the east which is particularly controversial in recent years, because the East tends to be more ethnically Russian than Ukrainians. As we'll know from 20th century history, having different ethnicities living in large clumps within a country can be a justification or form justification for casus belli. The whole Lebensraum argument was predicated on the presence of ethnically German minorities living in countries outside of Nazi Germany, for example.
Or just kill everyone and resettle the land as German land as well.
Oh, yes, of course. I'm not trying to say that the Lebensraum was a proper casus belli. I hope it didn't come out that way. Right, so this became particularly prominent in 2014 when the so-called Ukrainian Revolution ousted their premier at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Russian. In response to this, Russia annexed Korea in a surprise move. So the island on the bottom that you can see there is now occupied by Russian soldiers. It's fully defended. I believe there's a military base there as well. Whereas in East Ukraine, there has been an ongoing proxy war. They've taken some territory, but the border has shifted. Since then, there was a Russian incursion in 2015 of conventional troops, and to this day, it is controversial, though likely undebatable, that there is a Russian military presence assisting insurgents in the region. So let's zoom into the modern day. The fun fact, the current Ukrainian premier, Volodymyr Zelensky, is a former actor and comedian. I don't know if you know this. He played the lead role in a Ukrainian political satire called Servant of the People, Sluga Naroda, in 2015. He then got elected premier. So he played the role of the president, and then he got elected president. It's pretty unique in
meme
world
machine
history.
Right there.
Yeah. It's on Netflix if you want to go and see it, and I think it's quite good. I've seen the first season. And it was also this person, Zelensky's phone call with Donald Trump, which caused the first impeachment attempt in 2019. But we'll skate on to that. So, on to recent developments. So, satellite images and military intelligence do show a significant buildup of Russian forces on the border with Ukraine. If we go to the next source. according to So the US has said it would send reinforcements to NATO's eastern flank in the event of an invasion, which is suspected may be on the cards by some NATO planners, as well as imposing severe new economic measures against Russia if an invasion were to happen. With an estimated 100,000 Russian troops already gathered within striking distance of the borders, the situation is the worst it's been since 2015, when Moscow staged a large-scale incursion into Ukraine, clandestinely sending tanks and artillery to encircle Ukrainian troops and compelling Kiev to sign a peace agreement in Minsk that has since come close to collapse. This is concerning the East Donbas proxy conflict. Latvian Foreign Minister Rinkevich said work is already underway for a tough economic sanctions package, including the disconnection of Russia from the SWIFT banking system, sanctions on the Russian gas pipeline Nord Stream 2, and other economic sanctions. That package needs to be prepared so it can be applied reasonably quickly. We need to be able to target those who are helping Russia to get more revenues. So it's worth noting here that Europe is increasingly dependent on Russian gas. As Europe is obviously going green and trying very hard to move to green energy, we are still having to import a huge amount of fossil fuels from Russia. And this is what the Nord Stream pipeline is about. So it's an obvious strategic weakness in one sense, but European planners are hoping they will get their green technology up and running soon enough that we won't be perpetually dependent on Russian imports. Ukraine is obviously worried. Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov also pointed to divisions within NATO over how to respond to the threat of aggression from Putin's Russia. Unfortunately, Germany and France are very pragmatic, he says. They want to be close friends with the Russians. They're doing business with them, he said, referring to the controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline that is set to bring Russian gas directly to Germany. I think the Anglo-Saxon allies are more realistic and understand all the risks, Mr. Reznikov said, adding that it was time to take steps to deter Russia before it is too late. Now, I think the Anglo-Saxon allies are more concerned by Christmas parties and booster jabs at the moment, unfortunately. But Britain has sent some military engineers to Eastern Europe recently. They sent them to Poland and Lithuania, as we'll see next. The UK is to deploy additional troops in Eastern Europe amid tension in Belarus after thousands of migrants converged on the country's borders in the hope of entering the EU, which we covered previously. The Ministry of Defence announced on Thursday that 140 military engineers will be sent to Poland, adding to an existing team of 150 that are already based in the country. A separate team of reconnaissance specialists will also be sent to Lithuania. Poland and Lithuania, along with their Baltic neighbour Latvia, have been under significant pressure from migration originating from Belarus and facilitated by the Lukashenko regime for a number of months, the Ministry of Defence said.
I mean, this is an embarrassment for us because at the same time we have the boat people, sea people.
Well, yeah, I was going to mention that.
Yeah, and where are our engineers? Are they? Where's our army, our navy, anything? They're all in Poland.
Yeah, so this is a response to the Belarusian migrant crisis. The migrants are not Belarusian; they're Afghan and Iranian and so on. And it's not a response to the buildup of Russian forces on the Ukrainian border.
You know what's actually quite smart about this whole S show with Belarus? So after the, let's say, the falling out, because I don't want to go into all the history of the different problems with Belarus, but let's say the relations of Belarus have gone through the floor. Belarus decided they would offer tourist visas to pretty much like any Middle Eastern S-hole they could get, and they ran flights that were cheap.
Really?
So they just got them all to the airport, and they were like, oh, welcome to Belarus. Also, get on the bus.
Wow.
And they get them on the bus, drive them down to the border checkpoints, let them all out, and just have a bunch of army guys behind them. So it's like, well, you're not coming back. No, you're going over. Invade.
And Lukashenko then went and gave a speech and said, you can either go home or you can cross the border.
Yes.
But you're not staying in Belarus. You're not here on holiday even. It's pretty direct what's going on
because
there.
also he knows the dangers as well. I mean, you've seen them out there, and there was some friends of ours in the Polish parliament talking about it. There was shovels like hacking away at the border with the Poles and everything on the other side going, why the hell would we take you?
Yeah. But no, I just find it very remarkable that our military seems capable of protecting the borders of the EU against external migrants, but not the border of the UK against the EU, as we have thousands of migrants crossing into this country. Maybe what we should do is send these military engineers to Calais to build a proper wall so that they can't get to the boats. I'm sure Macron would love that. It's very strange anyway. So there was recently a summit between Biden and Putin, which I find quite amusing. This is usually phrased as the US president, President Putin facing down Joe Biden, but I feel like it's probably more the other way around. So they have discussed this issue. We don't know the details of what they've spoken about yet, but there have been numerous comments from outside. If we move to the next article, Admiral Tony Radakin, who took up the role of Chief of Defense Staff last week, said of the buildup of Russian troops, "It is deeply worrying. The significance of the worst scenarios in terms of a full invasion of Ukraine would be on a scale not seen in Europe since World War II." And that's true just by the numbers. There are 100,000 to 175,000 troops from what we can judge by satellite footage. UK defense sources believe President Putin's likely objective is to invade and occupy eastern Ukraine in 2022 and then seek a diplomatic solution, including the creation of a pro-Russian state there. Mr. Putin, who faced down President Joe Biden on Tuesday in a 2-hour virtual summit, has previously threatened to invade in response to increased Western military support for Ukraine. Putin has also sought assurances from NATO that Ukraine, a former Soviet republic, would not be permitted to join the defense alliance, but to no avail. He has described such a scenario as a red line. So here we start to get a glimpse of what this is all about strategically. It's the invitation of Ukraine into NATO, which may happen. And Russia has this geostrategic concern that they don't want to be bordering a foreign alliance.
So there's the complexity. Mm-hmm. Essentially, Russia is like, stay out of NATO or war, and some of NATO wants them to join, but the rest of NATO is like, I'm not dying for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've saw some of the, as you mentioned, the French not wanting to get involved. So I saw a little debate yesterday, Ericsson Moore being in there, and he was just like, look, we've made no promises, we've made no guarantees. They're not a member, so if they get invaded, their problem. And it's just like, well, kind of yes. They're not a NATO member, not guaranteeing their independence, and therefore, we're not going to send men to die for Ukraine. And Putin probably doesn't know that.
Well, I think it gets more complicated, and I'll analyze the whole picture when we get through the end of the coverage. But that's a very good point, and that's an absolutely justifiable position, I think, to stand on. Why should people in Western countries die for Eastern Europe?
Do you want to die for Kiev? I was like, not really.
But you can also make a powerful counter-argument to that, which we'll get to. Moving on, so Biden promised support to Eastern Europe, which I'm sure they'll be very happy with. He reassured the leaders that nothing would be agreed with Russia about the region behind the backs of its countries. Biden said, "Nothing about you without you," said Asta Skaisgirytė, who sounds Lithuanian. "We have said many times that we must be included in anything that is discussed in our region. Nothing should be discussed without us," says Linas Linkevičius, a former foreign minister and defense minister of Lithuania. "The intentions of Russia are well known. They were always trying to split, divide, marginalize, so that's nothing new. We have to maintain unity and a principled decision, especially when we have this possible aggression against Ukraine." So you can understand the perspective of the Baltic countries and the Eastern European countries. They don't have big militaries. They don't have big economies. They don't really have a lot going for them, to be perfectly honest. And they are on the border to this country, which has a large military and was previously an occupying foreign power. So you can understand there is a great deal of trepidation when it comes to Russian military buildups in the region.
But they've got the guarantees of the United States, effectively, defending them. Whereas Ukraine don't.
Right. But there will be no US troops on the ground, some of our American viewers may be pleased to hear. US President Joe Biden has said that putting American troops on the ground in Ukraine is not on the table. He warned of severe consequences if Russia did invade. The virtual summit that he held with Putin was aimed at reducing tensions in the region after the major troop buildup. Ukrainian authorities have said Moscow could be planning a military offensive at the end of January, although US officials say it is not yet clear whether President Putin has made a decision. So is Russia actually planning to invade? We don't know, but spokespeople have essentially said there is no sense of an imminent threat, partly because the logistics arms and medical arms aren't there in the build-up from what they can tell from the satellite footage. So they don't think that Putin has decided on invasion. A Kremlin spokesman has urged everyone to keep a cool head, and Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has warned that tensions could lead to a situation similar to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US and the Soviet Union came close to nuclear conflict.
Except Ukraine doesn't have any nukes, because they gave them all to Russia for a guarantee they would never be invaded. How did that work out?
Very good point.
Yeah.
President Putin has warned the West not to cross the red lines in Ukraine, including stopping NATO's expansion any further to the east and deploying weapons in neighboring countries that could threaten Russia. Putin has said if Ukraine joins NATO, then military contingents, bases and offensive weapons will follow, which seems like a reasonable geostrategic conclusion to that. Russia is already concerned by Ukraine's deployment of Turkish drones against Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine and by Western military exercises in the Black Sea. So is this just posturing? Russia does have an oversized military and it will use it to throw its weight around in the diplomatic arena. While military experts tend to focus quite rightly on the wartime application of military force, armies in peacetime are very expensive and must be used cleverly for a country to feel it's getting its money's worth. Using the presence of a large army to support Russia's geostrategic aims is one way to do this, whether or not you intend to use them. For a Russian leader, I think Putin is remarkably stingy with the lives of his soldiers, which, again, is a good thing. When you see previous leaders, you look at Stalin or Lenin, for example, the apocryphal quantity has a quality all of its own, very profligate with Russian lives. But Putin grew up as a KGB operative. He'll be well aware of the Soviet humiliation in Afghanistan. He witnessed firsthand the mess in Chechnya in the 90s, and I would say he tends to be a cautious operator on the world stage. His overt military inventions have been sharp but brief. Syria, Crimea, Georgia. We're all talking about short, sharp shocks in essence. Each one calculated to produce maximal diplomatic benefit.
Also Ukraine, as he's done before.
Yes. Each calculated to produce maximal diplomatic benefit for minimal military expense or risk. This is a judo approach to geostrategy, minimal application of force for maximal leverage. And the tactic might work. It's not like we have any deep-seated attachment to Luhansk and Donetsk, is it? If we go to the next article, administration officials have suggested that the US will press Ukraine to formally cede a measure of authority within its eastern Donbas region.
I was about to say never die defending something you can't pronounce, but then I realized I can't pronounce hardly anything in English anyway. So,
an interesting analysis. Yeah. Decentralization of Ukraine and a special status for Donbas were laid out in an ambiguous European brokered peace deal in 2015, but that never took hold and the conflict just smoldered. More autonomy could formally give residents of that region more authority over some local issues. The administration officials made no mention of ceding any territory. Biden will also have to finesse Ukraine's desire to join NATO. The US and NATO reject Putin's demands that they guarantee Ukraine won't be admitted to the Western military alliance. But senior State Department officials have told Ukraine that NATO membership is unlikely to be approved within the next decade, according to people familiar with those private talks who spoke on conditions of anonymity. So I would suggest that by marshalling his armies in Eastern Europe, Putin is reminding the world that Russia still exists. I think a lot of Western observers tend to fall into the single-player fallacy, or international relations people call it strategic narcissism. They approach international tensions with the mentality of a kid playing a single-player video game. They assume that the adversaries are programmed into the game and not capable of human-level decision-making, not living in their own world with their own universe of priorities and concerns. It's this strategic narcissism which can lead many to overreact to the posturing of Russian or North Korean threats of force. They view these countries more like automatons whose red lines must never be crossed lest war be the inevitable outcome. But I don't think this is the case. Looking at the situation from a Russian perspective quickly shows that large-scale conflict, and especially prolonged conflict, would be disastrous for the world's 11th largest economy, whose GDP, lest we forget, is half that of Britain's, and whose population has been shrinking for 30 years. So am I making any calls on whether there's going to be an invasion of Ukraine or not? No, I think it's entirely possible. I would be surprised if there is a large-scale intervention, but I am not an expert in the region, and we shall have to wait and see. What are your thoughts?
Oh, just that we shouldn't die for Kiev, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I know there may be some Ukrainian listeners who are not upset by that idea, but then would they die for Paris? Mm-hmm. And well, the answer is going to be no, because where the hell's that, you know?
Yeah, there is also the argument that if there were a large-scale conflict there, the West's troops may not be forthcoming, but Europe's borders will likely be open, which would undermine any kind of sentiment of resistance.
Well, this
in
is the
Ukraine.
interesting thing from the polls as well, because they've said when the invasion took place and the annexation of Crimea took place as well, which is now a province of Russia, effectively, regardless of international recognition, that's how it is on the ground. And the Polish took loads and loads of Ukrainian refugees from the eastern region. They traveled through, they got through the border, and the Poles took them. And then the Poles were asked, oh, by the way, can you take all of Mama Merkel's children? And they said, no, we'll take zero, number zeros. And if there are mass refugees from Ukraine because of some new invasion or something, it probably will largely stay in the east again. It didn't seem to touch us last time, so I would be surprised if it did.
Yeah,
Second time.
no, absolutely. But it's worth pointing out that the West's attitude towards these, where we are very reluctant to engage in force, but very ready to open our arms and doors and borders,
Well,
actually
only with
has
certain migrants. Because, I mean, that's the interesting thing. Like, the Ukrainians went to Poland because, well, think about it. Similar culture, kind of similar language, both kind of Slavic. So, the integration is not so difficult. The Poles can take care of them. There's some brotherhood and unity there on the basis that they're on the border and all the rest of it. Shared history. Where do we border Iran? What cultural similarities do we have with Iran? Linguistic similarities. We only seem to open our arms for brown immigrants. Whenever someone has brown skin, there is pity and all the rest of it. But if it's white-skinned immigrants, we don't seem to have that kind of same outreach. Like, we didn't make a special effort to import tens of thousands of Ukrainians.
I'm not so sure whether I'd say that's fair. I don't recall any great reluctance on our part to welcome Ukrainians in the earlier crisis.
But we didn't
for
make the
example.
same effort. You didn't see Mama Merkel being like, any Ukrainian that comes to Germany, we'll just take them. That's what I'm getting at.
It hasn't had the
it's not
same
just us
media
either.
prominence. That's true. It's like the Syrian civil war.
But I'm just, I'm endlessly reminded because there was no reasoning on Merkel's part to say any refugee because as the EU ended up showing, a third of them, well, I think it was 2/3, said more to be than anyone else. You can come here. What was that based on? It wasn't based on the status. It wasn't based on the situation. It was just based on the fact that it's just we don't want to look like the baddies. And they didn't have the same response to Europeans in similar circumstances.
That's certainly true. I do think that the Ukrainian conflict has suffered from a disgraceful lack of coverage. It seems to come up only when leaders have a reason to get involved with Russia, rather than necessarily out of any concern for the region or the people of Ukraine themselves.
If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to check out all the premium content we have on the site.
Yeah, we've got loads, and it's all really, really good. So why should you sign up? Why should you support us? Well, because you're going to get stuff there that you don't get anywhere else. Like the cultural series that John and I have started, which is talking about the politics and philosophy of science fiction. Because everyone was demanding it. And John was like, let's do Star Trek. Okay. And everyone loved it. And they were like, okay, let's do Stargate. And he had never watched this. And so he's like, is this military propaganda? I'm like, no, it's not military propaganda. It's basically a soap opera set in a science fiction setting. But anyway, we've got really great stuff like that. And then we've obviously got our articles, which have got audio narration for the Silver Tier members, such as this Anti-Civilizational Environmentalism by Hugo, as in, look at them. They want to actually erase civilization. And they're actually not very shy about saying it at this point. But anyway, moving on, we've got interviews with absolute mad lads, such as Miles of Kabul that you did.
Good guy. Did nothing wrong.
Ironically. This is the guy who had to be evacuated out of Afghanistan because he was on holiday there. Basically.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like, there's loads of criticisms of him that are out there, but we just sat down and went through them, and none of them hold water. So
yeah, he seemed like a really nice guy, and he's got a very placid temperament. Like, he's not like some sort of raging lunatic or anything. I was really surprised. I expected him to be mad. But anyway, we've also got loads of regular content, such as our book clubs. This is the Communist Manifesto that Thomas and I recently did. It's very interesting, if you're not a communist, to read the Communist Manifesto, because there are some telltale signs of conservatism that are embedded within it. I know that sounds hard to believe, but trust me, it's in there. Anyway, moving on, we've got our spicy podcast that we can't put on YouTube. Can't carry on talking about that on this channel. Anyway, we've also got the Contemplations, this one that you did with Josh, talking about Parliament.
Yeah, so
Does it work?
This is just an in-depth look at the system and where it comes from and why it's a bit of a meme. As mentioned, like the House of Lords. Why does that exist? It's literally just because like the Lords, the Burgesses and the priests and whatnot didn't want to sit with all the barons and whatnot. So they just separated into two groups in the King's Chamber, and then that became the two houses.
And that's how the system works.
Yes.
Amazing. And finally, we've got the epochs that Bo and I do every week. This was an amazing one. This was a Life of General Gordon. And I'm really glad I get to juxtapose this with the interview with Miles of Kabul, because you can see that these two characters, these two people, are cut from exactly the same cloth. Like, deeply Christian, like crazy adventurers, love living a life of danger. And the life of Gordon of Khartoum is honestly a real thrill a minute. Right now, I didn't know anything about him either, so Bo's taking me through what happened, and I was just wrapped. I had such a great time. But anyway, there we go.
Now, if you want to check us out on Alt Tech, be sure to follow us on Getter. So there's Getter.com, and the @ there being LotusEaters_com, because LotusEaters.com didn't work on the @ but it is the
But you
name.
can't put dots in the
Yeah.
names.
But anyway, go and follow us on Getter. And if you'd like to get access to all that premium content or all the free stuff we also have on the website, go to LotusEaters.com and subscribe. Thank you.